Happy Pride. Today marks 57 years from the Stonewall Uprising in New York City, which is often considered the beginning of the modern queer rights movement. I have been alive for less than half of that amount of time, but I'm going to share some of my reflections on queerness today of the things that I have learned in my past 26 and a half years. For one, I prefer the term queer to the various alphabet soups of LGBTQIA2+, or what have you, because I think it's more descriptive. In its original sense, queer just means different, strange, peculiar. But over the last century and a half, it has come to be used variously as a euphemism, a pejorative, and a self-descriptor for those who differ from society's expectations around their gender, which includes expectations of what other genders one ought to love. I have always been somewhat queer myself. From a young age, I liked the color pink. I liked wearing jewelry. For several years in elementary school, I would never walk anywhere if I could skip there instead. And I tended to gravitate towards other queer people. My elementary school best friend was a tomboy who is now a trans man. And when I was 12 years old, I realized that I was attracted to boys as well as to girls. I didn't initially know what this meant for me, and in my exploration, I considered various possibilities, one of which is that I might be a trans woman. I have a very distinct memory of wondering, could I be a trans girl? Because I do feel more like a girl than I do like a guy. My next thought was, no, I'm already too tall. No one will believe that I'm a girl. And that will probably make my life a lot harder. So best just to be a feminine guy. Turns out that's also difficult in its own ways. But about a year after that realization, when I was about 13 years old, I ultimately decided to come out as bisexual. A year after that, my freshman year of high school, I helped co-found our school's Gay-Straight Alliance, but throughout high school, I was the only out queer guy in the class of 2018. It wasn't until I went off to college that I started meeting other people who were like me. I met various trans and genderqueer people, and in 2019 at a Friday night gathering, one friend issued a general dare to swap clothes with somebody of the opposite gender. I put on a friend's dress and felt a way that I had not before. It was a somewhat queer feeling. I didn't fully understand it, but with hindsight now, I know that that was the first time I felt pretty. A few months after that, the world was swept by a global pandemic, which somewhat put a kibosh on my gender exploration. But that year, two close friends of mine came out as trans women. And the next year, I started dating a trans man. And I learned a lot through conversations with them. But I also learned and was influenced by various queer people throughout history that I encountered in my studies. Most notably, I would include Jesus. Jesus was a pretty queer guy who taught some pretty queer things. The social expectation of his time was that a rabbi would get married, but instead he chose to hang out with 12 guys. And his teachings, likewise, were quite queer, that the last shall be first, that it is not and that the first shall be last, that it is not those with material wealth who have been blessed by God, but in fact it is the poor and the marginalized and the dispossessed who are blessed and beloved. Most of all, one of his most radical teachings, which had a strongest influence on me, was his teaching that of the greatest commandment. Jesus taught the greatest commandment is that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. And that there is another commandment, which is like it, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and that there is no other commandment greater than these. I think he was right, and I would like if more Christians would also hold that as the highest commandment. This is not by any means a teaching unique to Christianity. Krishna teaches something very similar in the Bhagavad Gita, but I'm more familiar with the quote-unquote Western tradition, so that is what I'm going to talk about here today. Jesus had many other interesting teachings. For example, in Matthew 19:12, Jesus taught that there are those who are eunuchs from birth, and there are those who are made eunuchs by others, and there are those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let those who can accept this accept it. Don't tend to hear that one in Christian churches as often. Most Christians insist on reading it metaphorically, which, we're all entitled to read the Bible metaphorically, but it is interesting which ones they choose to and don't. And some early Christians, especially in the first couple centuries, did take this teaching literally until self-castration was outlawed by the Council of Nicaea. One, notably, was the theologian and eunuch Origen of Alexandria. Origen is often credited as being the first Universalist, as he taught a version of Christianity in which all souls, through a process of reincarnation, would eventually be reconciled with God. He later got condemned as a heretic for this, but so it goes. And the phenomenon of holy people being eunuchs, or eunuchs being holy people, is not by no means confined to Christianity. In the Greek and Roman world, there was a group of priests of Cybele, or priestesses, who were eunuchs and dressed like women. Eunuchs also were, in the strict sense, were men who had had their testicles removed to decrease their testosterone and thus produce a more androgynous appearance. Androgyny coming from the Greek word andros, meaning male, and gynos, meaning female. Though it was also, as you heard from that quote from Jesus, a word used more loosely to describe anybody who had a mixture of masculine and feminine features, combining today groups that we would distinguish between as intersex or perhaps transgender. And these priests of Cybele, the Great Mother, were known as the Galli. In fact, this is probably a much older tradition that derives back from Mesopotamia, where there were eunuch priests of the great goddess Inanna Ishtar. And it survived in Phrygia in modern-day Turkey until being picked up by the Greeks and Romans. According to later Greek interpretations of Phrygian myth, the first Gallus, the first of these priests, was named Attis. In some versions, he was born a eunuch. In others, he made himself a eunuch as an act of sacrifice out of love to the Great Mother Cybele. Ultimately, Attis dies and then is later reborn, either as a fir tree or as the heavenly consort of Cybele. There's some really interesting parallels between the stories of Jesus and Attis. Both are consumed by their love for God. For Jesus, it's the Heavenly Father. For Attis, the Earth Mother. They willingly undergo suffering and then ultimately die and are reborn, transfigured. There's also other similar practices in other cultures. For example, the hijras of South Asia, eunuchs who dress as women, variously described as eunuchs or as trans women, who are considered to be sacred to Rama and often serve in the temples of various incarnations of the goddess Parvati. Also, in the Americas, you have the various two-spirit roles that vary widely between different indigenous American cultures, but often involve somebody who is outside the gender binary and is also considered to be in some way closer to the gods. But my experience of spirituality isn't just limited to dusty old books, as much as I like them. At the same time I was learning about all these ancient religions, I was also working as a tour guide at Emily Dickinson's home and reading her poetry. Emily Dickinson, a notably queer person herself, the love of her life was another woman, and she also commonly defied gender roles of her time, preferring to be referred to as Uncle Emily by her nieces and nephews. And for Emily Dickinson, God was found not within the confines of a church, but out in the natural world. She was heavily influenced by the transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau. And reading her poetry and spending time out in nature really helped me to connect with finding God out in the natural world and in nature. It really bothers me when people say that trans people didn't exist historically, or that trans people aren't natural. The first I've already addressed, and the second, I think it's worth pointing out that nature is quite queer, more than we tend to give it credit for. I quite like the quote from a 20th century biologist, J.B.S. Haldane, who wrote, "Now my own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. I have read and heard many attempts at a systemic account of it, from materialism and theosophy to the Christian system or that of Kant, and I have always felt that they were much too simple. I suspect that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of or can be dreamed of in any philosophy. That is the reason why I have no philosophy myself and must be my excuse for dreaming." There are many forms of animals that do have sexual dimorphism, in cases where males and females of a species are different. There are other species that do not have any sort of difference at all, species that do not have gender or sex. Or ones that defy our common expectations, such as how male seahorses give birth, or clownfish can change from one sex to another spontaneously. There's also many other kinds of rather queer things out in nature. For example, butterflies, one of the most beautiful and elegant insects around. The process of getting from caterpillar to butterfly is not quite so elegant. After they go into their chrysalis, they dissolve into a goop, indistinguishable one part from another, and yet somehow they still retain memories from their time as a caterpillar. Butterflies are often used as symbols for transition and trans people because of that messy and yet beautiful metamorphosis. Sorry, I forget where I was going next. I have a lot of thoughts, and keeping them all in order. So those are some of the things that have inspired me and moved me along my journey. And it was last spring that I actually finally took the step on medically transitioning myself. It was in large part because because of the new administration that came back in, and I worried that access to gender-affirming care might be limited in the future, and I realized that that scared me, and I realized that meant I should probably do something about that. It was also not without precedent and much consideration on my part. For several years, I had often said that I wished I had been born in the first few centuries AD so that I could have been a Byzantine court eunuch. And I realized that I can do that right now. And so in last spring, in March, I started taking estrogen, and I liked how it felt. It felt like I was more in touch with my emotions than I had been before. But not all of those emotions were necessarily positive. At the time, I was also attending a Quaker meeting on campus, led by a non-binary chaplain. And I remember having several conversations with them about being angry with God, that God would let all of these terrible things happen. And I remember them asking me, is that the kind of God you believe in, a God who orders and orchestrates everything? And I realized that no, it wasn't. I believed in the God who is the foundation of all things, from which all things flow. It is the fire that lights the stars, the breeze that gives us breath, the water that sustains us, and the force that beats our hearts within our chests. That is the God that I believe in, the spirit of life, so to speak. And so I am now a little over a year into this journey of transition. Last summer is when I started wearing feminine clothes more regularly, because that is what brought me joy. It may be a queer joy, but in a world beset by sorrow and suffering, it is not a joy I am in any position to refuse. I took the name Fern because I love plants, and I feel at home out in the woods, in glades, sunny glades full of ferns. I also love ferns because they're very old. Ferns have existed since our ancestors first began climbing up out of the sea. And they are still here, one of the oldest plants still around besides moss. And though they are gentle and delicate, they are hardy and persistent all the same. They have always been here, and they always will be here, just like us. So, throughout my transition, I have often wondered why it was that God made me trans. Because as I observed when I was 12 years old, it certainly does make life more difficult. But I now think that God made me trans for the same reason that God doesn't just create roses. God also creates shrinking violets and wallflowers and ferns. Because God is infinite, God manifests in infinitely many ways, and many of those are rather queer, and yet they are all equally divine. Thank you.